right there.
When the B-66 was brand new, that wing was formed at Herbert, which is Alien Auxiliary Number something. Just, remember where Santa Rosa is? It's right along the highway there, heading toward Pensacola, out of, I don't know which side of Santa Rosa it was, but it's right there. Fort Walton Beach. It's near right at Fort Walton Beach.
I have memory. I remember Fort Walton Beach.
Well, there was we had that field. There was a 17th Bomb Wing, and then we flew those airplanes to Sculthorpe, England, where we replaced the B-45, which is an early tactical jet bomber. And
Ken, tell me about how, where are you from originally, and what made you go into the Air Force?
I grew up in Connecticut, and I was in my late teens during World War II. And as soon as I was 18 years old, I applied for pilot training and was successful and was able to get into pilot training and graduated in May of 1945, went through B-17 pilot training and was on my way to B-29 training when the war ended. Then I had a brief break in service while I went back, finished college, and then I was recalled with the Air National Guard unit for the Korean War. Subsequently was given a regular commission and made a career out of it then. And I was in Tactical Air Command for over half of my career, and then I got into Strategic Air Command relatively late in my career when I was about 40 years old. And this was 1961.
And what were the circumstances that made you go from TAC to SAC?
Oh, well, I had gone to a graduate study program. And I finished that, and I was asked for my preferences as far as a career for the next duty assignment. And I said, well, I'd like one more flying job. And so I went into B-52 pipeline it was a surprise to me, but I was pleased about it.
Castle?
Yeah, I did the pilot training, the B-52 pilot training at Castle, 3 months of that. But it took a year to do all the preparation because first I went to the nuclear weapons course which is at Wichita. And it was interesting because at that time the B-52Hs were on final assembly at Wichita, the Boeing Wichita facility. So I got to go out and see the airplanes that I was going to get to fly under final assembly there while I was going through weapons training. Then it was to advanced survival school, which now is near Spokane, of course, but then was in Nevada, out of Stead Air Force Base. So I went there and completed that, and then finally at Castle. So it was the better part of a year to complete the preparation.
Tell me, describe what was going on in the world when you took your first command of a B-52. It was a pretty uncertain time.
Yeah, it was. I suppose historically it was maybe the more tense period of the Cold War, although that's a hard judgment to make because I didn't know all aspects of what was going on, but it was a pretty serious thing in everyone's mind. We really believed in the mission, the idea that the retaliatory threat would be a preventative strategy and it would prevent war, and we believed in that. And we worked hard to make it credible, and so that was people's attitude, and that's why when I was selected to go into the B-52 program, I was pleased as a professional military person.
Describe for me what that mission was, though, to the uninitiated who's perhaps not familiar with the Air Force. We hear a lot about the nuclear weapons capability, and there were films like Dr. Strangelove that sort of poked fun at this threat of mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
Can you describe what your mission was and how it was supposed to work?
Well, our mission was to strike strategic targets in the Soviet sphere, in Russia itself, and in various Soviet countries. And we were assigned, each crew were assigned specific targets, very specific, and usually a multiplicity of targets because the airplane carried several weapons and plus air-to-ground missiles as well. And that was our job. So everything, our whole life was built around having an immediate capability to fulfill that very specific mission. And the thing was planned down to the very last thing you could imagine that would need to be dealt with, and it was all spelled out. And so whenever we flew a training mission, we simulated everything that we'd be doing on that assigned. It was called an emergency war order. That was the official reference to what our job was if we were launched to make a strike. And so first we learned about our actual mission, that is our emergency war mission, the real one that we might be called upon to do. And then all our training was designed to simulate that. And it was very well done. Everything was scored. There was a standard for everything, and your status and reputation as a crew depending on your reliability. You're regularly meeting those standards. And so we'd go on ground alert where for days at a time as an inter crew. Usually at that time there would be 6 crews from me on ground alert. And out there, the first day we studied, we refreshed ourselves with that wartime mission. Because we really had in our mind that we might be called upon to do this. It was not a sham. We were in dead earnest about if we're called to do it, we're going to do it. And it was immensely complicated. So we would spend the first day, let's say, going through 2 huge catalog cases full of materials that had to do with how you carry out the mission. And then the next day, we would get around to doing the planning for our training mission, which we would do after we got off alert. And that would take a day and a half. And then there would be other annual ground training requirements we'd meet while we were out there. So we stayed pretty busy on alert. And often we'd have practice drills, the klaxon would sound, and we'd roar out the airplanes. And sometimes we'd start engines, and then they'd call it off. Sometimes we'd taxi out the runway, just like we were leaving to go to war. And then when we came off alert, well, they finally had a pretty firm policy. We got a day or day and a half off then for rest when we came off ground alert, chance to acquaint ourselves with our families and so on, and then we'd go back and fly our training mission, which would typically be about a 12-hour mission. And as I say, it would follow the profile of the planned emergency war mission very, very closely.
But the idea was to not go to war, but to make the threat known to the Soviets so that they wouldn't attack us.
That was the idea, that we would be so good at it. We have such a good chance of getting through and doing our job. And they would recognize that and would be therefore restrained from making a preemptive attack on this country or any of our allies.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever give any thought, though, to we often heard a lot about people who were carrying nuclear weapons and having to carry out an attack because the United States had been attacked, but in a sense, wondering what you would have to come back to.
Yeah, we did think about that. And also, at least in my mind, I thought the biggest threat going into the target area was from other people's nuclear explosions. That was considered in the planning, so that if you arrived at your target or targets at the assigned times, you theoretically, hopefully, you would avoid conflict with other people's nuclear releases. But that was very uncertain. But our plan was that we'd get there first. We'd do enough damage to suppress the capability of the opposing side and minimize damage to this country or its allies.
Mm-hmm. How do you prepare yourself mentally or spiritually almost for that kind of tremendous responsibility?
Yeah, well, it's a long period of training, for one thing, and you become thoroughly indoctrinated in why you're doing this, what the need for it. Russia was viewed as a very serious, very eminent threat to not only the best interest of the United States, but the very survival of the United States as we knew it, and some other parts of the world. So, that was the motivation. And then when SAC was very well run, very tight ship, to borrow a Navy expression. And so we were carefully put together as crews and as units, and the morale was good, and we were good. And we thought we were good. I don't mean in a demonstration kind of way. I mean in terms of our own confidence that we could do the job. And that gave us a certain ability to deal with it, I guess.
Did you feel as if the proof that you were good and the proof that you did your job well was the day that the Berlin Wall came down?
Well, I've personally had thoughts about that. I was long since I left the Air Force when that happened, but I felt considerable emotion about that. And I'm sure many people that went through the Cold War has had some terrific feelings about that. Yeah, and not in terms of taking any particular credit, but just relief and joy that did occur. Yeah, I guess I'd like to think that I, in some small way, contributed to that.
Well, and everybody in SAC. I mean, whether you were at Minot or Grand Forks or
definitely,
or Fairchild or wherever.
Yeah,
it was part of a whole group of people.
That's right.
I guess one of the things that you probably understood, you talked about your training and indoctrination, was that there were Soviet pilots and Soviet ground forces that were essentially preparing for the same thing.
Yeah.
That you probably understood the threat better than most of us in civilian life did at that time.
Very likely, yeah.
And there was a substantial threat you feel to the United States?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Tell me about how your career progressed. How long were you in B-52s?
From 1961, about 8 years. 4 years as an aircraft commander, and then 4 years as an operations staff officer. And I took an early retirement from that, after doing first a tour in the Vietnam War, in the B-52 operation there. And
well, they had some interesting times over Vietnam. There were a couple of B-52s that were shot down, weren't they, over Vietnam?
Yes, they were vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles, and as best I recall, at least 2 were lost that way. Yeah, that was not the role that the airplane was designed for, but it was utilized. And,
that has to be an awful crummy feeling, though. You have your electronic warfare officer suddenly inform you there's a missile coming at you, and
yeah, I'm sure it would be. I didn't experience that. I flew 20 missions into Vietnam as an airborne commander. There would be 6 aircraft in a strike, 2 flights of 3, and the airborne commander would ride in the first aircraft to deal with decisions affecting the whole strike, all 6 airplanes. And I did 20 missions that way, and we never were threatened that we knew about with a SAM attack. We had anti-aircraft fire regularly, but it was not effective in reaching us.
Were those high altitude raids?
Yes. Yeah.
I just momentarily lost my train of thought there. So you voluntarily got out of B-52s?
After the Vietnam, yeah, after my involvement with that, I came back and participated in, I was there with the 99th Bomb Wing from Westover, and there were a number of crews from Fairchild with us at that time. But when I went back to Westover with that unit and did my part in getting that unit back into a nuclear posture with their regular emergency war mission, because the Cold War was still going on too, at that time. I had previously elected an early retirement, and I was allowed then to enjoy that privilege. And so I retired at age 44 because I wanted to have a chance to settle my family down and live a more normal life for a while. And that's when we came to Spokane.
Tell me about the attraction that aircrew members have to their aircraft. It seems like I've flown as a passenger to B-52 on 3 occasions.
Yeah.
And each aircrew member seems to have a sort of fondness for that airplane. Why is that?
Well, of course, it's not a fondness to a specific airplane, because you take the airplanes assigned for that particular mission. That is, whatever the number is not important anymore.
One of the pilots always tell me, especially at the time they let me take the stick for a couple of minutes, this is a forgiving aircraft.
Yeah, true.
That it will look out for you.
It will. I mean, I think that answers your question. A successful airplane, it certainly was successful in terms of being able to perform well with a great reliability. It was a very safe airplane, and forgiving. It was forgiving, all right, but you had to work within its capability and go with the procedures and so on. But the number of missions, the number of hours I've flown, and the safety record for the B-52 is phenomenal. And people had that confidence in it, and it was hard work. I wasn't a joy to fly. It was very truculent. You experienced that a little bit of that yourself, but it would do everything that you needed to do, and it would do it well.
Give me a little more detail on what it was like to fly a B-52. If you had to explain it to someone who never...
Yeah. Well, it's a lot of work. It takes a long time. I mean, if you go on a training mission, it takes you a day and a half to plan the mission. And then you walk out and it takes you, I forget now, but it seems to be about 45 minutes to do the pre-flight inspections. And then you go through fairly elaborate checklists, getting all 8 engines and all the operating systems online. And then there's a great deal of very close crew coordination in the whole process all the way through, which is part of the job satisfaction, really. But anyway, that's also a challenge. And then I'll never forget the feeling of turning on to a runway for takeoff and having all 8 of those throttles, and the amount of thrust and power at your disposal there is rather incredible. It never gets routine, you know, it's always a kick. And the B-52H had so much potential power in the engine that the co-pilot was set a thrust gate to block the throttle short of full throttle, because there was enough power there to pull the airplane into a vertical climb if the throttles went all the way to the wall. So they had to be stopped at a point appropriate to the existing pressure, altitude, and temperature, so you wouldn't overpower it. So there was plenty of power. And then the takeoff was exciting because you had an elaborate procedure for getting the flaps up. You had to maintain a precise airspeed schedule during the retraction of the flaps. It never was easy. And then you establish a climb, you kind of catch your breath a little bit, and then we were also, up against something that was going to be scored. The first thing would be probably a navigation leg, and it had to be precise, and mostly that was the nav team, but the pilots had to be sure that the airplane was where headed and in the direction and at the speed the navigators were counting at. And then there would be entry into a low-level route, which was pretty exciting, sometimes at night, sometimes in marginal weather. And flying an airplane like that at low level, it wasn't designed to do that, so that was work, and always interesting. You climb out of that and then usually have a refueling, and no matter how many times you did air refueling in that airplane, it was always a challenge. And you, of course, always under a lot of pressure to complete that refueling. And then after that, there'd be maybe defensive exercises for the gunner and the electronic warfare officer. And finally, after 12 hours, you'd land usually about 3 o'clock in the morning, pretty darn tired. So it was a lot of work, but it was interesting, and the satisfaction of doing it right and getting good results was, never got old.
You mentioned the enjoyment of working, of close crew coordination.
Yeah.
Tell me something about that.
Well, even on takeoff, everybody had something to watch. Co-pilot is checking everything the pilot's doing, and the navigator was calling off speeds because you're checking the performance of the aircraft during the takeoff roll to make sure that the airplane is ready for takeoff, that it's not going to be necessary to abort. And even on the climb out, I guess the most intense crew coordination is on a bomb run. Everybody's involved in that. You have several ways of acquiring the target, and you got a lot of help from technical equipment, but that equipment can fail or can be in error. So then you've got to get back to more fundamental ways, maybe just with timing or whatever it takes. So everybody on the crew, including the gunner, have a part in backup timing or identifying particular points in the approach to the target and the time of release. And the pilots are making fine last-minute corrections on the aircraft heading to position the aircraft to release the bombs at the right place. And so it's very intense between the navigation team downstairs and the pilots upstairs, and then the gunner and the electronic warfare officer doing their part too. So everybody gets in the game.
You must have had very close personal relationships with these people even when you weren't at work.
Well, we saw more of our crew than we did of our family. During that period, my wife was pretty well took care of raising the kids, and in fact, when I get home, and other crew members had the same problem, your wife is taken over, she's in charge, and you would come home and you're kind of used to being in charge. So there'd be a little conflict there for the first half a day or so at home. We finally became aware of what was going on, and we were able to deal with that, but it was a problem for a lot of people. But yeah, the crew is close together, and it was a great relationship, really. We were so dependent on each other for everything going right, so our status and our reputation would be untroubled. And also, of course, at some points it was a matter of our lives depending on each other, doing the right thing at the right time. So that's very bonding. And my first 4 years was at Grand Forks, North Dakota, and the winter conditions were fierce. And seems like when people are facing some hardship and difficulty, it pulls them together. Whereas if it's all comfort and ease, then conflicts begin to arise. I'm not sure why that is, but it seems to be that way. My crew got along very well. I don't remember any personality conflict. We just are pretty busy taking care of each other.
What was airborne? Okay. Some of the from a personal standpoint, what was like being a crew member.
Yeah.
What was airborne alert like?
Well, it was demanding on the whole unit. That is, the whole number of wings had this responsibility. I was involved with it first at Grand Forks, North Dakota, and we had an orbit over Thule, Greenland, and we would take off fully loaded, the airplane ready to go to war, nuclear weapons and missiles as well. And then we would fly up to Thule, and then from Grand Forks, which it was about a 5-hour flight, as I remember, and we would get a refueling just before we got there, an air refueling. And then we would orbit for, I guess it was over 6 hours, because the mission was about 22 hours long. So it was about 6.5 hours up and a refueling, and then like maybe 8 hours, I guess, on orbit, and then 6 hours back. And there was a second refueling too, or two. And so it was long, and it was a long mission. Then I did it again out of Altus, Oklahoma later on, where we had an orbit over northwestern Alaska. And I can remember flying the orbit leg, looking into the sun in the west. It was trying to set, but it just never seemed to set. We'd just be chasing that by the hour. And it was tough. You wanted the day to end, and it just kept going and going, and the airplane kept grinding along. But yeah, that was the idea. We're sitting right up there close to the pole and halfway to our assigned targets. And so that was a card to play in a very serious game. And I can't remember for sure how that related to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Vaguely, it seems to me that came about that time. I'm not sure whether it was a result of that or it was just part of the general play of the Cold War at that time. But it went on for a couple of years, and then an airplane on airborne alert went in, crashed in Spain, and not long after that, that program was phased out. I think partly too because tensions between the two countries were a little bit less. The Cuban Missile Crisis did get resolved, and so that gave maybe a new confidence that we didn't have to take our alertness to that degree.
But you still had ground alert after that, I bet.
Oh yeah. Ground alert out here at Fairchild was just up until just before they shut down Strategic Air Command. It was slow to die.
What went through your mind when you heard that that Fairchild was basically alert status was over?
I thought about it a lot. It was the end of air, and thought about all the hours and days, and then people devoted their good part of their lives to maintain that posture for a very long period of time. And it was just a relief to have that. Just the fact we didn't need to do that anymore was a great blessing.
Do you recall any situations where you were unusual things happened that you later discovered were connected to world events?
I do remember on airborne alert over Greenland, the crew and myself spotting what we thought was a Russian icebreaker down the ice. And so we reported that to the base facilities at Thule. And we had identified it visually, both the pilot and the co-pilot. And then the navigation team was able to identify it on radar, by the radar return. So we were pretty sure there was something there. Though, you sit there looking at the ice cap for long, you get a little bit, you could be hallucinated, I suppose. But anyway, we reported it, and they did, and we came back on an orbit leg maybe an hour later and thought we still saw it. And they sent a patrol aircraft out to look for it. They never did find it. So I don't know what the shooting was. We had ourselves convinced it was a surveillance, Russian fishing, the kind of processor, fish processor that was there for surveillance purposes. breaking through the ice. But we never did know what the outcome of that was.
Mm-hmm.
We had one time on one of the missions into Vietnam, we had a crew that had just come into the theater. It was their first unsupervised mission. They were, I think, number 3 aircraft in the second flight. And we were refueling, that is, we being the 2 flights of 3, were refueling on parallel tracks. Each airplane, 3 airplanes taking a turn on each of 2 tankers. And the crew, the pilot allowed, or something resulted in a pretty harsh contact when the boom entered the refueling receptacle on the top of the B-52 cabin. And the emergency war, the EW, the emergency warfare officer, excuse me, the electronic warfare officer.
You're thinking emergency war orders.
Yeah, right. The electronic warfare officer interpreted that to be, a threat to the aircraft, and he ejected. Well, that was rather awkward because this airplane now doesn't have any, pressurization, and it's loaded with bombs, conventional bombs, but loaded with them. And where are you going to send that airplane? It couldn't go up the altitude because of the not being able to pressurize. And at that altitude, 20,000 feet, actually that wasn't really, they need to get lower than that as soon as they could. Having completely, the cabin is now ambient, it's now outside air. It must have been terrifying for that crew, I'm sure it was. So we had to sort out where they would go, and their first plan was to go to Manila, the Philippines. I thought that might not be too good for foreign air. So I think we got them to go to Kadena, Okinawa, and they got there successfully. They never did find the electronic warfare officer. There was a storm raging in the Philippine Sea below us with waves to 6 feet and ocean swells, and we just didn't have much of a chance. That was that could have had some repercussions, but what kind of...
As you think back about your time in SAC and the Air Force in general, and about the time you served and the conflicts that went on in the world, what would you tell your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren about that time and about B-52s and about your role in it?
I've got grandchildren, and I've never talked to them very much about it. I'm not sure.
If they came up and asked you about
if they asked me, well, it was the whole concept of Strategic Air Command and what they had to do is remarkably. It was a big operation. It was unique. It was remarkably well done from a military operational point of view. So I would speak with some pride and about being involved, being able to meet the individual performance standards that were expected through that, And I am satisfied that it was in the best interest of the country, that it served its purpose. And I would probably make that case with them.
It was a good fight.
Well, I think so, yeah.
What have I left out? Is there anything that I've overlooked or issues that we might have come to your mind that we haven't talked about?
Well, I think we've covered these pretty well. About the airplane itself, it had a lot of unique things, but that might be, that gets into detail.
Tell me about them.
Well, a couple of things. One in particular, very unique about B-52, and that was its crosswind landing gear. That all airplanes have to eventually or often approach a runway for landing, and the wind does not just necessarily blow right down the runway for you. It's coming at a crosswind component more often than not. And so in any airplane but a B-52, you could put the airplane in a crab that is aim into the wind a little bit on the final approach, or dip a wing, create a little side slip, and that would keep the airplane lined up at the center line of the runway. And then just as you flare before touchdown, you roll the airplane level, straighten the nose up, and land rolling straight down the runway. Important you do that, otherwise you'd wipe out the landing gear if you landed in a crab. Well, it turns out the B-52 is so big and cumbersome at those slow landing speeds that there's no way you can get it back from a crab to a straight down the runway attitude. And so Boeing engineers designed gear that could be cocked or turned in a manner that allowed the airplane to be cocked, canted, or crabbed off the the runway heading, and you would land in the crab. And the first time a pilot does that, it's a terrifying experience because you've been trained to kick that thing out and get it straight down the runway. The consequences for not doing it being very severe, and now to let that thing stay in a crab and roll in a crab fashion down the runway was an experience I'll never forget, particularly the first time. And it worked like a charm. It would complete with reliability. At the end of the roll, you'd reach back and hit a centering button, and the airplane would straighten itself up over the landing gear. And you would turn out the runway like any other airplane. But that was pretty unique.
I've seen pictures of that, of a B-52 coming in, and it looks wrong.
Yeah.
The wheels are bent. Something's going on here.
Yeah. That was just one of the unique things.
Did you ever have any emergencies in flight that you thought were going to be a real problem, and it ended up you were able to land successfully? And
the airplane was so reliable. I don't remember any serious mechanical failure the whole time, and nor do I remember very many in the unit I was in, or units. I was in 3 different strategic wings over that period. I remember one time coming back from airborne alert, arriving at Grand Forks about wee hours of the morning, and there was 50-mile-an-hour direct crosswind over the runway, and that would be pretty tough to make a landing. So we had to go to I think we went to Wurtsmith, New Hampshire was the nearest alternative, and we didn't have a lot of fuel. And we had enough to make it though, but had to really keep an eye on things. Question whether we should try to refuel to get more fuel before we got there. So it was a sweat for a while, but we had enough fuel, and we did get into Wurtsmith.
Somewhat worse than being on a vacant highway late at night, wondering if you've got enough gas.
Yeah, a little bit worse. Although I don't know, in this country, in this day and age, being on a vacant highway at night is not too happy a prospect either.
Al's going to take a couple of pictures of the two of us enjoying your backyard, and then I would like to bring out that black and white picture you have, and I'd like you to.
And now he works for the Army Center for Worldwide Medical Supplies.
Fort Belvoir.
Fort Belvoir, yeah, exactly. Nice base. Station we visited up there last year.
Well, those bases that are close to the Pentagon are always just a little bit more posh than the
They
ones
are.
out in the.
I think they got about 16 or 18 generals on that base and 2 golf courses.
Yes, I believe it.
Pretty nice.
Yeah. Well, I grew up, when I was a kid, my dad was in the Oregon Air National Guard. And we used to go out there once in a while. The weather office was right above one of the repair hangars. And in those days, they were flying old F-101.
This is back at Eglin?
No, this is at Portland.
Oh, this is Portland, the Oregon. Excuse me.
My dad did not make a career out of the Air Force. He was in for, I think, 6 years, and then was a CPA and was a weekend warrior for 30-some years. But we used to go in and see the old F-101s.
Go around and do no-nose inspections of tactical units to have them demonstrate their war mission and simulate it. And a lot of these units at that time were F-100 outfits, and they'd have some 2-seat ones we used to train. And so we'd go along as observers on one of those 2-seaters. And I'd been in B-66, so I'd never been in F-100 before. The first time.
When the Thunderbirds were here several years ago, I got to go along. They had an F-16B. The B model has a back seat to it.
Yeah.
I'll never forget the last thing I remember the pilot saying was, "Here we go." And I had sort of expected that in an F-16, you'd, like a car, you just accelerate, and then maybe gradually pull the nose up and just climb. And he kicked those afterburners on, and the nose snapped. It just went kabang, straight up. Oh, that's amazing.
You're fortunate you got to have some of those rides.
Well, I've always made it plain. They put us in a gunner's harness in the back, so that we couldn't fall out the door. But I remember when they opened up the doors, you could smell the pine trees. It sounded. You told me at one point you were in personnel.
Yeah, I had a secondary military specialty in personnel. And served as a back on duty. I had. But that gave me a secondary military specialty. told me, and then when I came to Spokane, I pursued that. I was personnel coordinator at the hospital for 3 or 4 years.
Oh, good.
We just didn't. So. This flight did turn out nice. It was kind of grim and cold here this morning.
Well, I actually thought about that as I was packing the kids into the car, thinking, we're going to have to change our plan. I was kind of expecting it to rain today.
Well, Jane was saying, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, Steve's going to take care of this. I don't have to worry.
Yeah.
And then the sun came out. I sure you arranged it. So what are your applicants?
I think she likes it much more than the executive level stuff that she had been doing.
Well, she was too far removed. She'd been trained as a nurse. She was too far removed from patient care, I suppose, to be really happy. So that's great.
Yeah.
She
likes it. So that's I actually have any need for some perfectly nice birch cabinets. I'd be happy to deliver them. But
worked for that was working around it for years.
But you don't think about having to move everything out of the kitchen.
Yeah.
And so the rest of the house is in absolute disarray.
Right now, it's all part of nothing works.
In turmoil. Tell me about this picture.
Okay. Well, that's a B-52H, and that picture was taken in about 1963, and this is my crew at that time. The reason this is an official Air Force photo, not a very good one because we need fill light on our faces, but you can get an idea from it. And we had won an EWO knowledge contest, that is a contest among the crews in our wing, and also we won for our wing, and then we went against the unit over at division and over at Minot, and we were the division, air division champion, and we got a trip to London out of this. That is, we got to fly B-52 to London. Only that's another story. But anyway, that's why they took this picture. So the crew was very proud of what they'd achieved there.
Is that you
and this
right
is
there?
starting. This is Herman Adams, the tail gunner. He's not a tail gunner. He sat up with us in front, but the guns were in the tail. He was a very strong crew member and a delightful guy. This was the emergency war. There I go again. Electronic warfare officer, John Randall, outstanding young officer. This is a navigator. His name was Montgomery. This is Archie Henderson, who was a radar navigator, who incidentally went on to be a navigator on the RS-70s, RS-71.
SR-71.
SR-71, which is kind of surprising because he's kind of a easygoing, kind of quiet guy. I mean, but that's what he did after he left the B-52 program. This was excellent co-pilot, Hank Dwight. He was a great guy. And I was proud that when I left the crew to go on staff as an operations officer, he was upgraded to aircraft commander and kept the same crew, which they didn't usually do in SAC because the co-pilot was seen in a different light by the crew maybe in some crews. But in this crew, there was enough mutual respect here that they accepted him as aircraft commander. And I was very proud of that. This guy with the teeth here, I think that's me.
How old were you when this picture
40.
was taken?
That's about 40 years old. Yeah.
And how long had you been flying buffs at this time?
Probably about 3 years. Yeah.
Were you on station when Kennedy was assassinated?
Yes, I was not on duty. I was downtown in Grand Forks, North Dakota with my wife when the news hit us. Yeah. Yeah, we're in Grand Forks.
Do you know what happened to these guys? Are they...
I regret to say I've lost track.
He went on to SR-71s.
I did know that he went on to SR-71s.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of them, I'm sure, I know he went on to become an instructor at Castle, at the crew training instructor for SAC. That. But I just, you move so much, I've just not done a good job of keeping up with people, I'm afraid.
Well, and you go into other crews and other responsibilities, you bond to a new situation.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. But I keep those guys in my memory and in my hearts. I tell you, they were a great bunch.
It seems to me that this is really so much of what the experience is of being part of a B-52 crew is the sense of camaraderie and almost brotherliness that you develop with these men. Yeah,
tremendous bonding. That was it. They had strict policies about how many substitutions you could have on the crew for even a training mission, or when you went on alert. They had limits. You could substitute maybe for one person and So it was really an integral crew. You flew together and you lived together and you were prepared to go to war together. Yeah.
So that was a new airplane in those days.
That was a very new airplane, right? Yeah. It's the last. It was the H model, the last one's made.
Did you ever fly G models, or it was strictly H?
Never flew G models, but then in Vietnam we had the D models, old ones. You know.
Mm-hmm. What was the difference between the D and the G and the H? I mean, it was just.
Well, the G2, if I remember correctly, had turbofan engines, which gave them more power,
Mm-hmm.
and it had the rudder was shorter, so it was less, maybe less vulnerable to control stress or to aerodynamic stress because of the shorter, maybe a little more efficient, and just had some updated systems and some improved reliability and more range and so on. Just a little enhancement of the
Mm-hmm.
same machine.
Does it surprise you at all that they've flown B-52s this long? I mean, they're still in the inventory.
It amazes me. It amazes me. I thought when I left the Air Force, the program was probably coming to a close, and that was 25 years ago. Yeah, it's amazing. Sure is. Oh.
Tell me what this is, Ken.
Well, this is an Air Force B-66. It was an all-weather, nuclear-equipped light jet bomber that operated for a relatively short period of time, especially compared to the B-52, just a few years during the late 1950s. And it was important in my experience in the B-52 is because of being a pilot and operations officer in this program in Tactical Air Command. When I went to SAC, I was immediately trained as an aircraft commander, which is very unique. Usually someone would have to spend several years as a co-pilot. Mm-hmm. But the
wasn't supposed to end this way. In little more than an instant, 4 lives and a legacy that stretched back 50 years came to an end. But it's important that what happened at Fairchild on June 24th, 1994, not conceal another story. The story of why bombers came to Spokane and why they had to leave. The arrival of heavy bombers in Spokane was tied directly to the outbreak of war in 1942. The attack by Japan on American forces at Pearl Harbor set off a ripple effect on the mainland. War meant a need for heavy bombers. Spokane had already beat out Everett for a new aircraft repair depot that would repair hundreds of B-17s and B-24s. It was named Galena.
When we first went up, the concrete was still soft on the floors when we would bring the airplanes in to repair them. The concrete was, but nevertheless, we started working on the airplane.
As the war heated up, battle-damaged planes lined up for repairs. Many didn't look as though they could even fly. One of the most famous planes to touch down here was the Memphis Belle. It was the first plane to finish a complete tour of duty during the war. George Scamahorn was working on it one day and found that some of its crew members were not as lucky.
There was blood, signs of blood on the floor, where I had to take the flooring out in order to, do some electrical work or something. And I took the floorboards up where the tail gunner would be, and here's this blood sloshing around.
There isn't much left of the old Galena Air Depot, but what is here acted as a foundation for something new. Galena would eventually move and become Fairchild Air Force Base. Fairchild was home for the better part of 40 years to B-52 bombers, planes that were the front line in America's defense against nuclear war.
Yankee, Golf, Tango, 360. 30 megaton nuclear device used for airburst at 10,000 feet.
It was a dark time that generated some dark humor. Movies like Dr. Strangelove poked fun at the possibility of global destruction. But for the people who flew B-52s in the early 1960s, there was very little to laugh at.
Well, it's a B-52H. And that picture was taken in about 1963. And this is my crew at that time.
Ken Mcknight was a B-52 pilot stationed at Grand Forks, North Dakota. As part of the Strategic Air Command, he lived and worked under the same rules that people at Fairchild did. He also worked towards the same goal.
It was a pretty serious thing in everyone's mind. We really believed in the mission, the idea that the retaliatory threat would be a preventative strategy, and it would prevent war. And we believed in that. And we worked hard to make it credible.
Credibility involved flights that sometimes went on for 24 hours. They needed multiple in-flight refuelings, all while loaded to the teeth with nuclear weapons. Back in the 60s, the world was a troubled place.
Russia was viewed as a very serious, very imminent threat to not only the best interest of the United States, but the very survival of the United States as we knew it, and some other parts of the world. So, that was the motivation.
And then I went into the station and grabbed a crowbar and a sledgehammer, and I could hear them guys hollering in the nose, And about the time I got to where the village tavern is now, it exploded.
The rush to meet the Soviet threat did leave victims. In September of 1958, two B-52s collided over Airway Heights. It was a nightmare of fire and twisted metal. The accident happened over Joe Martella's service station.
And another guy was in the station with me. He ran across the street, and he was running so hard this way, looking back, that he ran into the old post office building and broke his kneecap. But nothing touched anybody. It was amazing that it didn't. Had that plane continued on the route that it was going when it started to bend, why, it would have wiped out a lot of people.
"29 years later, there was another demonstration of the dangers of cheating gravity. 7 people died when a KC-135 working on an air show routine with a B-52 passed through its wake and crashed. The Pentagon later ruled that big planes were no longer allowed to perform acrobatic maneuvers. B-52s at Fairchild survived many crises, both because they were very reliable and because they were much cheaper to fly than newer, more sophisticated bombers. The one thing they could not survive was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union disappeared, there was no reason to keep a worldwide fleet of bombers. There were celebrations when Fairchild came off alert. That meant planes would no longer be ready to repel a Soviet attack 24 hours a day. But there was also deep uncertainty. Would a base that has always been home to bombers that are no longer needed have a place in the new military order? The answer is yes, but the bombers had to go. The terror of a gunman's shooting spree at the base hospital and the crash later the same week made a lot of people forget the day they said goodbye. Goodbye to B-52s, and for some, goodbye to a way of life.
Man, beautiful job.
Isn't that nice?
Tail number 1040, the last B-52 ever built, is also the last one flown by an active-duty crew at Fairchild Air Force Base. The plane that crashed in June had been kept here so that bomb loaders who had not yet moved could keep a training schedule.
Flight check 70, affirmative. Flight check 75, roger.
There used to be 14 B-52 bases around the country. Now they'll be shared among just 2. Fairchild is not one of them. For the people who flew them, it isn't the loss of an airplane, it's the loss of many friends who made the big planes.
Yeah. Bittner fueled it. I trust him.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
I'm just sad. I hate to see the airplane go away. I hate to see most of my buddies leaving. It was very much like an extended family. We all lived together when we were doing alert. We were eat, sleep, live, for weeks at a time out there. And everybody's sent to the 4 winds. And the majority of us will not be working with other people from our squadron. And we built up a lot of trust through the years, and that trust is hard to gain without experience with people, and I hate to see that go away. And that's from the heart, sadness to see it happen.
For a plane designed to fly anywhere in the world, this last flight is insultingly short. Just a 2-hour hop to Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota.
Let's give it a little more air, see if it'll rotate. There it goes, it's moving.
Still, the people who will pilot this plane on its last journey volunteered for this assignment.
It's our Project 70. What's your current altimeter setting?
Altimeter is 2994.
There are no bombs on this flight. There will be no practice runs over an imaginary target or mid-air refueling.
Look at this, man. It all came out. What a good feeling, huh?
For the people who fly B-52s, it's one last flight with a professional family.
Affirmative, wind 020 at 2, clip takeoff.
Ready? All strapped in? Let's do it.
My crew, we were together for about 2 years, and pieces of us were together probably for 3.5 to 4 years. And you get to know their inner workings, not only of themselves, but their families. And it's very much like an extended family. You know, aunts, uncles, cousins, the children play together. And in that respect, it's like seeing a family member leave and move away.
And before this crew and this plane move away, people on the ground will get one last look.
He's going to go out, hold till 15 till the hour, and then he's going to come inbound, do a high-speed, low-pass over the airport and depart IFR.
Here it comes.
Get the format button. Here we go. Here we go, fellas. Now, stow the thrust gate.
Stowed.
Going to 5,000 crew.
It is sometimes hard to remember that this plane is an instrument of war. Only a small number of the nearly 800 B-52s ever built actually went to war, but war and destruction are issues that guide these flyers.
The whole job of the military is to defend our freedom and the freedom of the whole world. You know, the U.S. is a world leader, and so thus it is the freedom of the whole world. And you have to keep that thought in the forefront of every other thought. And you have to trust your leaders that they're going to send you to a conflict that really is in the national interest and that you should be sent to.
109.9 and 96 is in.
There is no view like the one in the front seat of a big airplane, especially when you're flying over a place like Glacier National Park. With no training schedule to meet, you can actually enjoy the view and think about how much you'll miss it.
There's some sadness there, just because when you've been a part of something that you have enjoyed, there's always going to be some sadness when they do away with it. Kind of saying, well, we don't need you guys anymore, which, you know, that's for anybody, I think that would throw some feelings that you wonder why.
We'll attempt the VFR arrival at Minot, and we'll contact tower. We are now 20 miles out.
The destination of this flight is just on the other side of the clouds.
So 02, roger, cleared visual approach runway 29. 02, cleared visual approach runway 29, sir.
For the people on board, the other side of the clouds is also the place where they leave their old jobs behind and begin to craft new careers.
This is it. Gear, flaps, lights, air brakes, fuel.
It was built tough and very rugged, and I know it's got me out of a few places that I shouldn't have been before, just because it's so stable and so forgiving. And it's taken good care of me. It taught me how to fly. So it's been a very good experience.
And for this experience, it's time to say goodbye and welcome home.